time to put on the glasses for story time. So that's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. In the last vlog entry, we celebrated the 2-year anniversary of this channel, and it made me at the pub that night reflect on, the number of different kind of weird events that conspired to me being in Scotland, 47 years old, with a YouTube channel with 30,000 subscribers. And there are many things that I could cite, from going back to having piano lessons, to flunking out of school, to being kicked out of a sample forum. But if there was one single thing that you could remove from that chain of events, which would mean the outcome was different, that would be Albion. The whole of this Spitfire Odyssey's success hinges on Albion. It's the thing that made Paul and I pivot our lives, our families, our careers entirely into a different direction. And talking of Paul, well, one of the greatest pleasures of Spitfire Audio, this Odyssey, has been its centering around this successful collaborative relationship. And I think one of the things that makes it successful is that we don't come to each other with finished products or ideas for finished products. We come to each other with a notion. At the very beginning, the notion, the whole thing that Spitfire Audio is based on is, why do people record samples differently from music? What would it be like if we would approach it, instead of making samples, of making music one note at a time? And another more recent notion was, why is it that our favourite samples are always the quietest layers? Why don't we make a library that's just the quiet stuff? Became Tundra. And Albion, well, I have to be candid with you. Paul and I had this bespoke sampling project with about 30 customers for about 2 years. And we'd made that age-old mistake of going, here are our earnings coming in, and we spend it on stuff going out. And when the tax man comes and says, can I have some of that money that's come in? We go, no, because we've spent it all on our IP. Works like that, doesn't it? No. It doesn't. So we had just the mother of all tax bills. It was like being on the Titanic, but moving really, really slowly. It was 2 years over the horizon. Simply no way of being able to pay this off. So we had to come up with a successful concept that was more mainstream, that wasn't just for 30 rich AAA composers, but was more for all composers, more for composers like Paul and I. And this is where the notion was born. Paul and I, as jobbing musicians, I was about 10, 15 projects deep at any given time. So time was not on my side. And what I found with orchestral samples, even the ones that we were making, is the complexity of use and the sheer scale of the libraries slowed me down. The fact that we had hundreds of different articulations meant that I was kind of wading through the weeds when I was trying to absolutely smash these cues out. Also, I was pinned here to my, well, not here, but to a studio that was similar, pinned to the spot. There was no way that I could make any orchestral music other than here. The concept of being able to write on a plane, or be able to repair a cue in a mix, or indeed work from a hotel room, was simply absurd. I remember I was feeling really hungover, and I was on a double-decker bus in London, and I was just having this horrific kind of paranoid anxiety attack about this tax bill. And this notion arrived, and I immediately got off the bus in Trafalgar Square, and I rang up Paul, and I said, Paul, I've had a notion. He said, what is it? I said, of all the terabytes of samples that you have, what percentage do you use 95% of the time? And he said, at best 5%, maybe even 2%. And therein lied the question. What if we were to make a library that just contained that 5%? And I remember Paul's initial response was so kind of an orchestral library. And I said, yeah, well, an orchestral library, but not based on sections, on ensembles, but also, those cinematic drums you use all the time, those amazing kind of Brian Eno-y synths you use all the time for drama, and kind of drama loops that are not full bandwidth, but really simple. What if we were to make a single package that contained all of those elements required to make modern film scores? And so Blitzkrieg was born. I remember pitching it to our accountant, and actually the success of Albion ONE, it's the first time he's witnessed it, has exceeded the business plan we made by 20,000%. Anyway, he said to me, Christian, all of this kind of war-y stuff, it's a bit kind of depressing, isn't it? A bit negative. So I took that observation to an amazing mix engineer called Gertz Bernhardt, who's from Germany. And I said, Gertz, Blitzkrieg, good, bad word? And he went, Christian, bad word, bad word. So it then became Albion, based on the name of, I believe, a Pete Doherty tour, or it might have even been an album. But basically, my wife was on tour with Pete Doherty, and we had this poster. And it wasn't because of the name Albion that my eye used to be drawn to, or Pete Doherty, or indeed my wife's name. It was the guy who was third on the bill. It used to draw my attention often, just thinking about when our kids were growing up, at what point we were going to have to remove this poster. So we went into this servicing that initial idea for the marketplace, that it was really quick and easy to use, you could slam out cues in seconds, and that you could do it on the red eye between LA and New York. What we didn't realise was Albion would also be the perfect entry point for people starting out in orchestral, in film, TV, games music, who hadn't experience in creating orchestral music, who hadn't been to music college, just like myself, who were confused by the massive array of orchestral sampling and how you use them, the steep learning curve. So naturally, the orchestral element became the focus, and this really wasn't my department of excellence. So Paul set about studying a whole bunch of scores to establish a consensus of what is that 5%. And with thanks in advance to Paul for giving up some of his weekend this weekend to make a little film for us about that.
When we were working out what to record for the original Albion, we looked at a lot of film scores and a lot of orchestral scores. And there were some things that kind of came back with some consistency. And a couple of them were things like the cello and basses always played in octaves, or at least 95% of the time they were playing in octaves. It's a sound that is very difficult to reproduce when you don't record it like that. So that was one easy call. When the horns and trumpets are playing together, they are almost always playing in octaves as well, and that's because the ranges just don't overlap. When we looked at the way that we would want to use the low brass, again, a lot of the time, to give it the power and the kind of sonority, we would go for octaves again. It was completely different with the woodwinds. The key things for the selections that we made with the woodwinds were that we wanted the option of using the piccolo, but we didn't want to have to use the piccolo. So we recorded two sets. We recorded one with piccolo, flute, clarinet and oboe just throughout the range. And then we did another set where it's just two flutes at the top. When we recorded the violins and the cello, one of the things we wanted to be able to reproduce was the sound of ostinatos, especially with Blake's incredible ostinatum machine. So we looked at the way that that would work best, and what we decided was we would reduce the section size and we would record two different styles, one that was designed for very, very fast, very, very spiccatissimo, basically, and then one which was slightly more leisurely, but still had that kind of feel of just a little brush on the strings. We decided to include piano, but we didn't want to sample the whole piano, so we took inspiration from Jerry Goldsmith's scores, and we looked at making what we called an attack piano, which basically, I think Sound on Sound said it sounded like it was played by a black belt karate master. So the key thing, the key driver throughout the design of the orchestral section of Albion was, what do you hear most in what we called back then epic film scores, but let's say film scores with breadth and a real kind of big dynamic to them. What is the way that the orchestra plays in those types of scores? And then we went back and kind of reverse engineered it and recorded stuff that when you played it back, it would just instantly give you that sound out of the box. And another key thing, final piece of the jigsaw in a way, was the inclusion of 4 mic positions. The close mics, which are really only there to give you extra point and detail. The decatry, with its outriggers to the sides, which gives you the full kind of width and the position of the orchestra. And then the ambient mics further up, which gives you the increased spaciousness and, if you like, a kind of slightly extra bit of epic air into the recordings.
And of those original sessions, I have to say there's still 2 patches that are very difficult to beat, which are the spiccato ostinatum. You just hear these still to this day on everything. There's an inaccuracy about them and an unevenness that makes them both difficult to work with, but also incredibly realistic. There's a romance to sampling. You know, you think things are going to turn out a certain way and you get these surprises, you get these disappointments. And this, for me, is my most favourite patch that we've ever made. And we've tried to replicate it, and for some reason there was just magic there on the day, the way it was balanced, the way that it was orchestrated. And it's the short flutes patch. So it has this kind of Jerry Goldsmith quality, whilst it's also great for kind of John Adams stuff. So back then, I think there were only 5 of us, and none of us were full-time for Spitfire. So there was Paul, who was kind of editing and building and producing the orchestral samples. There was me doing kind of artwork, and I designed the GUI for the original Albion. And have a look at this. You'll see that whilst none of our GUIs ever really looked like that, it's definitely got the beginning kind of seeds of ideas for all of the Contact GUIs we've made since. We had Blake Robinson, who was doing all of the scripting and lots of amazing tools that we use in the background and lots of QA. Andy Blaney, who largely was doing the legato programming, but also QA and some amazing demos. And finally, James Bellamy, who created our site and basically the distribution systems. And that was it. The design fell to me because I was marginally better at Photoshop than Paul. And here are the kind of initial design concepts. Now, my brother, Keaton Henson, is a successful singer-songwriter, but he's also a really good artist. And he is a real kind of, as my father refers to him, as a Victorian wonk. And I took that inspiration to create some Victoriana. I thought that was a kind of slightly grand time in Britain's history. So thought that the kind of combining Albion and the fact there was this horrific, sprawling empire around the world would give this sense of oneness. Initially, the logo was made out of a font called Bleeding Cowboys, and I didn't realise that Keaton said that basically it's against the law to use Bleeding Cowboys. And there are sites dedicated to people spotting and taking the piss out of people who did use Bleeding Cowboys. So he gave me the Albion font, which is actually something that he built up and designed. And you can see from this first version here that neither Paul or I knew how to actually fit it into the contact pane so the keys weren't cut off, but we thought that was good enough. There was also a kind of roughness to the way we approached Albion, which meant that it wasn't as pristine as most other sample libraries. So when finding some photography, I think I Googled Victorian photographers and found this guy, Roger Fenton, who's famous for his images of the Crimean War. I was of the view that just the way that samples were being made in those days, we should just observe it and try to go the opposite way. So the look and feel, very different. But even the way we named stuff, I wanted it to be evocative. So we named many of the elements after different kind of Victorian characters and people like Brunel, Darwin. Paul concentrated largely on the orchestra. We both collaborated on the percussion ensemble, which were what we'd done over the years was we'd done a series of free libraries called Bang for our consortium of 30 users, just as little freebies that we used to give them at Christmas and stuff. And we'd learnt that really big percussion instruments actually don't sound that big for kind of repetitive passages. So actually Darwin is a series of orchestral percussion sessions. There's some taikos, stuff like that in there, but it's largely processed and manipulated into the kind of hyped epic drums that you hear today. Then I set about working on the loops. As I mentioned before, the problem with loops, they tend to be a bit showy-offy. You get these full bandwidth things. It's like, well, one, it feels like someone else's work just kind of inserted into your own. And two, there's nowhere else for you to go. There was a thing by Spectrasonics called Meta Loops, which was massively popular. But again, it really had a specific kind of characteristic. So I suggested to Paul that I actually create some really organic sounding, very plain loops that operated in single bandwidths. And I recorded this with a single KM184. and I tracked everything, so played everything twice in my flat in Rupert Street, Soho. And for anyone who's visited London, Rupert Street is a kind of den of iniquity, very noisy place. So I did it very early mornings after the milkman had been in my corridor. So it was kind of quite a claustrophobic affair, this really tiny corridor with this KM184, really close miking stuff that I was recording very quietly. I remember I did a metal stool, and I think we've still got some of that original material in there to this day. A real highlight, something that I think is very popular and a much misunderstood instrument, is the trumpet fiddle. Which isn't someone fiddling with a trumpet. So I was unpacking some musical instruments that were moved up here 3 years ago, and totally coincidentally, I found the original trumpet fiddle. This is an instrument from the early kind of 1910s, I believe, and it's basically it's a single string down here. This machine head is knackered. Which is resonated through this gramophone horn here. And what's extraordinary is I can see that it's been slightly damaged in the move. But what I can see here is I think this may have been actually the needle. Did that work? Did it sit on like that and then the horn came out like that? Yeah, because this is definitely falling to bits. So that was played tapping using a pencil. But also the horn itself. But I hear that thing on absolutely everything. And I always kind of smile and just remember that day that I went to Hobgoblin and got flogged this piece of trash that has actually been quite successful as a consequence. Drums done, loops done, and then finally I set about creating sampled synth content. Paul and I agreed kind of inexplicably, certainly for me, that synth stuff that was made out of organic material tended to mix better with organic, specifically orchestral material. I think that's why you tend to use spring reverbs on synths, because it creates that organicness. So Stevenson's was made from a lot of the Albion orchestral material, but warped. And I remember Paul literally got it hot off the presses from Air Studios and just sent me a bunch of kind of tidbits that I then turned into this library. And my favourite was actually created from the Celeste that we had recorded for Orchestral Percussion, which actually came out before Albion. And I'll just see if I can find a Celestian and put this into all sorts of crazy reverbs. And it's a real favourite both of Paul and mine. Then I came up with the idea that we were going to provide, because ostinatos, kind of that kind of stuff really popular at that point. It was the kind of height of their popularity. So I thought we should provide people with some ostinatos. And basically I went about actually physically recording sequences based on the Albion sounds that were hard baked. And I remember Paul and I were working so hard to get this done. We were also working on masses of projects as composers, that I went to the studio really late at night to try and record these ostinatos. And I remember just being like hit by pure like physical exhaustion. So much so when I got home, I had these symptoms that were like hypothermia and was kind of shivering like an absolute lunatic. I remember ringing Paul and saying, listen, I hate to disappoint you, but that graveyard shift last night, I just wasn't able to do it. I basically found my kind of outer envelope. And he said, Christian, don't worry, Blake will come up with something. And Blake basically invented, I don't know, the best way of describing it is like an orchestral arpeggiator, but specifically designed to create ostinatos, which I comically called ostinatum. And it's really weird whenever I hear people kind of quote this neologism and they go, yeah, I'm using the ostinatum. Like it's actually a thing. It's just a silly thing that I came up with. Ostinatum. Orchestra, drums, synths, loops, all done, packaged together. I wrote the user manual. I always maintain that my eternal penance for never having read a user manual was having to write them for the first, I think, 8 years of Spitfire's existence. And indeed, the original user manual, I've put a little link to it down below for you to have a look at it. My ridiculous grammar and poor Photoshop chops. And it's been extraordinary to look back at these old relics, and they all sit in a Dropbox folder that Paul and I share with the code name Sandwiches. Yeah, Blitzkrieg stroke Albion was originally codenamed Sandwiches. And the final piece of the puzzle was the walkthroughs. Now, we were real YouTube rookies in those days, basically used YouTube as our kind of cloud server for video tutorials. Paul was developing his, amazing style of walkthrough, and I went, well, let me do the non-orchestral ones. And I don't think I've ever even admitted this to Paul. Paul, I'm sorry about this. But I, again, because I was so massively busy, had finished a job, hadn't managed to get my walkthrough for the non-orchestral stuff done, and went to a mate's birthday party. I thought, I'll just go back after the birthday party and do a screencast. And I am absolutely roasting drunk on that walkthrough. And in fact, if you have a look at that walkthrough, I've timestamped it below. There's a point where I move the GUI off screen to, I don't know, access something, Google something, and I just leave for half of the walkthrough. You can't actually see the GUI, and I was too hammered to notice. And so you'll see the kind of rough and ready cowboy nature of what we were doing back there for Spitfire. It was released, and it was our first series of really amazing awards that we got. But still in those days, we were talking about 1 or 2 units a day. So much so that as this kind of Spitfire kind of furnace started building, Paul and I used to refer to Albion as a currency. So I remember going to visit him in the States, and Spitfire had to pay for my flight, and I said, sorry, Paul, that's 4 Albions. It's the kind of currency we used to deal with. But slowly and gradually, and I guess this reminds me of my I have a successful career making library and production music, and every once in a while you'll just switch on the telly and something really unexpected will be using your music. Well, it's like that, but with knobs on with Albion. You could just hear it on absolutely everything. And what's interesting about it's not only kind of an entry-level kind of way into orchestral. You hear really kind of big composers and you go, oh, they were clearly really up against it, because Albion comes out when you're stuck. What dawns on me is how homemade Albion was. We thought we were being massive pros back in the day, but thinking back to it, we were just, there are no courses to, that you can go on to be a sample developer. So we were literally making it up as we went along. It was a kind of, I always describe it as like, rubber bands around jam jars in the potting shed at the end of the garden. Something so whimsical, a notion followed by a bad German word, followed by a name inspired by an even worse English word. Something so whimsical has changed our lives forever. And without sounding immodest, I think that Albion has been an entry point for many people wanting to make kind of big cinematic music, working with orchestral sounds for the first time. So this kind of whimsical springboard now means that there's 75 people who work at Spitfire, Paul and myself included, and we have a royalty department that distributes royalties to, I think, near on 400 musicians now. So we've created another revenue stream for musicians, something Paul and I are incredibly proud of, and it all started with a notion. About 4 years ago, Paul and I, we'd moved on to different products and like symphonic range and all of this kind of stuff. Now I had to pull up an old cue that had Albion in, and I started playing it, and I rang up Paul and I said, mate, have you checked out Albion recently? I think it's just starting to creak a bit. We'd learned so much from making Albion itself and then the subsequent libraries that we'd kind of moved on as samplists. And he rang me back and went, you're not wrong, mate. It's a bit knackered, like an old kind of car that's not starting in the morning anymore. I said, well, I think we should go back in and create it all over again, but take all of the lessons we've learned. Also, a lot of the feedback, people were loving the unreliable nature of stuff like the ostinatum strings, but also wanted something a little bit more responsive and bitey. So we went back in and recorded what is now referred to as Albion One. When we retired Albion Legacy, there was this kind of outcry, and I know a lot of our friends went, are you sure? And I have to say, probably the most nerve-wracking experience of Paul in my life was relieving ourselves of our most popular product because we didn't think it was good enough, it wasn't quite up to scratch, and replacing it with Albion ONE. However, as I mentioned before, to this day, there are things that we just can't beat. And I think it's poignant that about 3 weeks ago, finished my latest TV series production that I've been working on. It's this franchise called Inside Number 9. And I think it's ironic that the last cue that I wrote for that was on a coffee table sitting in the lobby of a busy hotel. And why was I sitting in that hotel? Well, we were recording maybe, I don't know, I would call it the next chapter in the Spitfire journey. So it's kind of ironic that I was using Albion as it had originally been conceived, and the reason why I was having to use Albion was because of Albion. Thanks, as always, for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this story. It's been nice to kind of reminisce about the creation of something kind of just so random but so profoundly kind of impactful for Paul and I. If you haven't subscribed yet, lots coming up. In fact, I'm working on a really good piano book with some new free pianos in it. Ding that bell to be notified the next time I put a video up, and one of those, always much appreciated. See you next time.